It's a pleasure to be back here in Exeter, actually. I was here back in 2019, so it's good to be here again. Dave was particularly modest, since he has been essential to this project. For those who know my work on narrative in the making of national security and that kind of work, this may seem like a bit of a departure. I'm not going to speak to it directly, but I'm happy to, in Q&A, talk if anybody's interested about how these different parts of my brain seem to work together. I'm going to have to talk a little bit from over here because the cables don't reach all the way over to there, and also I have a fair amount of data to show you. So I'm going to talk from over here, and this way I won't be in the way. I want to start by just making a bold claim, which is that we are living in an age of global militarism. Now, you may well be pretty surprised to hear me say that. I think that before I began this project, I would have been pretty surprised to hear me say that. After all, it was not very long ago that Steven Pinker, all of you will surely have read or heard him speak about the better angels of our nature and the decline in the use of armed force. And of sort of the ways in which humanity's civilizing instinct, according to Pinker, played a role in that, regardless of what you think of Pinker's thesis. And many of us have lots and lots of good questions about Pinker's thesis. Interstate wars are quite rare things. Notwithstanding the ongoing bloody carnage in Ukraine, notwithstanding the war in Gaza, though Gaza probably won't make our databases of interstate wars at the end of the day, global arms sales are indeed at an all-time high, and yet, despite that, for the most part, states are keeping their powder dry, at least when it comes to war with other states. Yet militarism, and I'm going to argue militarism as I understand it, or properly understood, is nevertheless pervasive. Beginning in the 1960s, advanced industrialized states began turning away from the mass army toward recruiting their soldiers on a market basis. And at that time, famous military sociologists like Charles Moskos, then of Northwestern, Morris Janowitz, Moskos famously said that military service was becoming just a job, as he put it, as opposed to a duty of citizenship. But in the ensuing half-century, what we have discovered since that time is that many, many post-conscription polities nevertheless romanticize and idealize their volunteer soldiers who are recruited for service on the open labor market as if they were paragons of citizenship and patriotism. They celebrate them as heroes who sacrifice for the common good, rather than as competent professionals who are doing a dangerous job. Put differently, these polities, my own and this policy, are embracing militarism in those moments. At first blush, I would say that the emergence of militarism at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century is surprising. So let's just take a little bit of a historical tour. If we go back centuries, militarism was once purely elite-focused, right? It was mounted knights who personified the chivalric ideal. And it was the officers who hailed from the nobility who were the only ones who were able to get decorations for battle once upon a time. Medieval, Enlightenment thinkers, meanwhile, often expressed contempt for soldiers, who they thought of as the dregs of the dregs. With the rise of democracy as a political ideal and regime, this begins to change. With the emergence of nationalism as a popular ideology, with the spread of technology that makes having a mass army a priority, militarism itself became a mass phenomenon in the 19th century. It is only at that time that common soldiers became eligible for decorations for bravery on the battlefield. It's then that military service becomes a mark of good citizenship, and the army comes to be widely spoken of as a school for the nation. But I thought that militarism would have waned over the last half century, precisely because warfare between industrialized nations became rare, because the full-scale mobilization of total war receded, because technological developments in democratic politics replaced men in service increasingly with machines, because mass armies gave way to professional volunteer forces. But even as the conditions that once invited and sustained militarism, even as those conditions abated, militarism has arguably spread and strengthened around Europe. So what I'm going to talk to you about today for about the next 35 or 40 minutes is, one, why has militarism been on the rise? And secondly, what are its consequences? And I'm going to begin by presenting various pieces of evidence to sustain this claim descriptively, because I've so far presented no evidence to you that militarism is actually on the rise, pure assertion. And then we're going to turn to elucidating the consequences. Where I am in this project is that I've written many articles on the subject, both for scholarly and general interest audiences, but I've actually not written a word of it as a book yet. I'm presenting to you my vision of what the book will be in part. I can't cover everything in the title that I'm hoping to use, at least that's where I stand right now. But I'm beginning 2 terms of leave that will allow me to hopefully write the book project. And so whatever you have to ask and other audiences as I go around the UK, it's going to have a big impact. What I want to start with, though, which is a bit less exciting, don't worry, there's going to be a lot of fast and furious data as we go on, is a little bit of conceptual brush clearing. Right? Which is, I use this term that Sarah and I were talking about earlier about militarism. And militarism is a loaded word with virtually nothing but critics. It's hard to find somebody who says, yes, I want to be a good militarist. Right? Nobody wants to be a militarist. Many have defined militarism in broad or elusive ways. The German socialist Karl Liebknecht wrote a book a century ago that was 400 pages long that did not bother to define the term. Right? That's sort of the nature of it. Volker Bergan wrote a very influential book, I think it was in 1981, that rightly says militarism is and always has been a word of political propaganda and polemic. But I think militarism deserves a place in our lexicon if we properly define it. Now, the first way that people often talk about militarism that I think is rather unhelpful is militarism as a dominant discourse that makes the use of military force possible. So from this vantage point, this is the militarism of the pacifist left, and this is the view that it says that militarism is a discourse that advances empirical claims that serve an ideological function. Right? It makes the use of force, it makes the institutions and technologies necessary for its deployment, and it makes investment in those institutions and technologies, makes all of that seem required, seem necessary. In fact, it makes it seem like common sense, which is how dominant discourses function. And if you did not have this kind of militarism in the sense as this dominant discourse, then the use of force would be both inconceivable and, frankly, practically impossible, because you would not have the kinds of resources one needed to be able to deploy military force. The problem is that this way of understanding militarism essentially makes all states into militaristic states. Right? In this very basic way, there's only one country I know of that does not conceive of using military force, and that's Costa Rica. Right? That's where it is basically an invariant phenomenon. Right? Moreover, when one state is militaristic in these terms, then, as Alex Wendt and many others have argued, that basically all states have to be militaristic in these terms. Right? And militarism, therefore, borders on the trivial. It is a constant across the globe. More plausible to you may be militarism number 2, which is a way in which I think many of us have used the term. The idea that this constitutes militaristic uses of force is the use of force when it is excessive. And this is the militarism of the moderate left, one might say. So when we say the US is militaristic, or Israel, or Russia, what we often tend to mean is that we're saying that policymakers, when they're reaching into their quiver of tools of statecraft, they reach first for the militaristic tool. That they think of military instruments as inappropriately as a solution for political problems. This view does not say that military force does not have its value, that there aren't circumstances in which it is both ethical and efficacious, but it says that the problem with militarism is that a state is militaristic when its policymakers use force excessively, too often, and notably under the circumstances when the use of force is ineffective, unethical, even counterproductive. This is the distinction that one of the earliest books on militarism in the late 1930s, the historian Alfred Watts writes a big book on militarism, distinguishing between what he calls militarism and the military way. And this is what Watts more or less means. Problem here, and I admit that at times I've found this use militarism myself this way. The problem is that as a social science, as an analytical matter, this presumes that we would be in some kind of agreement as to what uses of force are ethical, what uses of force are appropriate under given strategic circumstances, pragmatic circumstances, that there's some kind of consensus understanding of a baseline with regard to the use of military force. But we all know there is no such thing. If there were, we all know there's no such thing because you've taken courses with your professors who make very clear the kinds of very fundamental debates that take place with regard to appropriate levels of the use of military force. We have no clear way of distinguishing indefensible, counterproductive militaristic uses of force from their defensible, ethical cousins. It becomes essentially a way of criticizing uses of force that we might find objectionable. And we've all probably used it that way. The way that I'm going to use militarism throughout this talk, though, is as a set of cultural practices that works to promote an idealized image of the armed forces and its representatives. Militarism, in this sense, involves romanticizing and venerating a nation's soldiers. And to be clear, when I say soldiers, just from now on, I mean that in the kind of colloquial sense, including Marines, airmen, sailors, right? The way that we would colloquially use the word soldiers, right? Uniformed service people is the proper term. It's a mouthful. When we idealize and we venerate the nation's soldiers and officers, when we place them at the center of the nation's civil religion and its rituals and its rites, this is what I mean by militarism. It is present in the speeches of politicians that extol soldiers for their virtues, that hail soldiers, again, not as professionals potentially doing a dangerous job, but rather as paragons of patriotism, as avatars of self-sacrifice, as embodiments of heroism, as exemplars of good citizenship. Militarism, in this sense, overlooks, and by implication, it regularly denies that soldiers in most countries around the world today are recruited via market mechanisms, that militaries must compete with civilian employers for labor, and that very often, across the West, they are losing that competition. Right? Many militaries are suffering from recruitment crises. It denies that individuals' decisions might primarily or even substantially be driven by what we know to be true in part for some people, which is by the emoluments associated with military service. We know that soldiers' motivations for enlistment are highly varied. But we also know that at least for some soldiers, a significant portion of the time, it is driven by the pay and benefits associated with service, or militaries would not have, again, trouble with recruitment. This is very well, and especially when the economy is doing well. In this sense, number three, militarism has been woven unevenly into the rhythms, the practices, and the symbols of everyday life across the world. So, enough with that conceptual stuff. Right? How do we know that this is actually increasing? So I have a number of different cuts into this. One cut into this is, the one thing we do ask questions about regularly has to do with trust or confidence in the military. Now, what do you see from this? This is the global data. This is some of the regional data. In almost every region in the globe, on average, between 2006 and 2021, trust in the military in the blue, more trusted than any other typical set of institutions. More than trust in the police, more in trust in financial institutions, certainly more than trust in government. Nobody trusts politicians. And more than, on average, trust in the judiciary. And if we look at this over time, as you'll sense, in almost every region between 2006 and 2021, right, and it's hard to go, we actually don't, the question was oddly not asked as often as I would have liked before that. So here we have pretty good coverage in the data. It's been increasing. Some places it's lower than others, right? Higher in Western Europe and North America than in Latin America and the Caribbean for obvious reasons. But notice the slope line in both places largely heading up. I also ran a series of surveys myself in France, Israel, the UK in collaboration with David, and in the United States. And then I got the German Bundeswehr Military Institute to add some questions to their annual survey. And we asked people, what is the primary reason you think that people serve in the military? And there's a very interesting story to be told here about why the views are so different from country to country. David is a co-author of an article we published in Armed Forces and Society about this past fall. I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. What I want you to take away from here is that notice that in France, in Israel, and in the US, far more people are saying duty and patriotism than one might otherwise think. If we combine those all the categories down to two, right, to intrinsic categories, that is intrinsic to the South and extrinsic to others, notice that in France and Israel, far more people believe in intrinsic motivations than extrinsic. The Israel data is a bit peculiar. I'm happy to talk about the QA. It's not exactly identical, because as you all know, Israeli soldiers are generally conscripted, so this question is not about soldiers, but about officers who are volunteers. In the United States, right, it's pretty much 50-50. In the UK, and then especially in Germany, extrinsic accounts are much greater. Point is, there's a lot of variation, which tells you, in some places, we have these kinds of idealized representations of the military. Some places, by this data, by this cut, a little bit less. That's only one way of thinking about it. We can also look directly at the kinds of rites and rituals in which people are engaged. So I don't have finalized data to present to you, but I've had a team of undergraduates collecting data about military-themed holidays around the globe. Again, we don't have comprehensive data. This is an ongoing project. But one thing I wanted to share with you is how it's strange how many new such holidays we have. I don't actually even know the stories behind these holidays. As I said, we're just collecting the data, right? But the very fact that in this country, we have since 2009 a brand new holiday known as Armed Forces Day. Why would South Africa establish a new such holiday in 2012? Of course, no one's surprised by Ukraine in 2015. They didn't call it Armed Forces Day, it's called Defenders Day. Right? I'm just calling it a general rubric of Armed Forces Day. That's not surprising, but these are definitely more surprising. Or consider Spain, for the first time in its entire history, started celebrating the equivalent of Veterans Day in 2003. The Netherlands in 2005, the UK in 2006, Denmark in 2009, and on and on. Germany, 2024, just this past spring, they actually haven't celebrated, they just passed it in Parliament. So they've not yet celebrated for the first time. We will get it for the first time in just a few months. I think I know why they've done this, right? In Germany anyway, post-2022, the German military is not recruiting enough people. Let's give them some social prestige, right? Maybe that'll have some positive effects on recruitment. But that doesn't really explain why all these countries decided to create new Veterans Days. And then, strikingly, for instance, Norway created for the first time in its history what we in the US call Memorial Day, or here you call Remembrance Day, for those who have fallen. In 2007, China, this is delicious, they call it Martyrs Day. I've known, the Chinese Communist Party using such a religious language. Martyrs Day in 2014, celebrated in Tiananmen Square, televised for the entire nation to see. Xi Jinping is there. He doesn't speak. He just arranges the bows. Every year, he arranges the bows on some bouquets, some very large bouquets. There are 9 of them, which I believe the symbolism is that in 9, now I can't remember, it's 8 or 9, whatever number it is, it represents eternity in Chinese culture, so that those who have died will be remembered forever. Why do we get, right? We get these surprising number of new military-themed holidays. This is only a partial list. I'll have more for you if I were to come back in a year's time. Students are doing this for me this semester. And then we also tracked how are Independence Days being celebrated around the globe, and what's the role of the military in these Independence Days. This is actually a completed project. We looked at the top 50 countries in military spending, collecting at least 2 data points from each decade, from the 80s until 2020. COVID threw everything out of whack, right? So I don't have good data from the 2020s, because obviously a lot of countries canceled things, they're only beginning to bring them back online. we created a little bit, we asked a series of questions for each of these data points. Is there a parade with a military presence? Does that parade contain a significant display of mechanized military technology or weapons platforms? What is the size of that military contingent? Is it held at a military site? And does it involve some kind of mourning of fallen soldiers? Now, did something that makes me deeply uncomfortable, which is that I took all this data and I made a militarism index. This is pretend scientism, right? You could change the index in various ways. This struck me as a reasonable thing to do, but I don't want to pretend that this is like the way to define, right, by numbers, what what looks like on Independence Day. But if we had, military parade being rated on 0 to 3, I can go into the details here if you want, how technology and platforms was a binary variable. The military size could be 0, meaning no military presence, 1 meaning a really marginal presence. Think like, a handful of people firing guns or doing a flag-raising ceremony, which is very common. And 2 is, think, right, France on Bastille Day, or North Korea, right? Thousands of troops marching by, and hundreds of missiles and tanks and armored personnel carriers. Held at a military site, and it was their mourning. That's a 0 to 10. Right? We could change the formula in various ways. It's not going to fundamentally change anything. But the point that's significant is that does this go down at all? Any further? Okay. Anyways, you probably can't see, but this is the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and 2010s. Lo and behold, the Independence Day Militarism Index shows that it is increasing. And not only is it increasing over time, but it really doesn't matter in terms of the slope, whether you're in the top 50% of military spending or the bottom 50% of military spending as a percentage of GDP. Regardless, right, now maybe not surprisingly to me, those that are in the top 50% of military spending as GDP are higher on the militarism index. The part that I want to draw your attention to is the slope of these lines from the 80s through the 2010s. They're all going on the upward direction. And it almost does not matter what regime type you are. So here in black this is in orange, we have all the regime types. Most consistent is the black, which is democracies, right? Autocracies declined from the 80s to the 90s. I think that has to do with the end of the Cold War in all likelihood, right? And then we get the return of sort of high scores in the militarism index, ending up in the 2010s exactly the same place as democracies. Anocracies, which is governments that are between democracies and autocracies, on the polity scale between -5 and 5, they are simply fewer in number over time. So by the time we get to the 2010s, there are very few data points here in the top 50 in military spending. But then we start to say, well, what's going on? What is accounting for this? And is there some element of our militarism index that's driving this? The chief answer seems to be yes, and it seems to be about military parades. And in fact, every aspect of the Independence Day parade and the role of the military in the parade is increasing. The size of the military contingents, whether there's a military presence, and whether it involves, that lovely, whether you've got large military technology and platforms. If we just look at the military parade component of the index, you end up again with that increase over time. What does not seem to be driving it is mourning on Independence Day. There's a big increase from the 80s to the 90s, but then not much after that. It basically plateaus. So, of course, now I've given you 3 pieces of evidence. What explains all of this? What's accounting for this? I don't pretend it's a big complex, like most big complex social phenomena. Not so easy. But I have something that at least I think will tell you three important mechanisms. My working argument so far is that militarism is in significant measure the product, like other important social phenomena, of democratic political paralysis. We all know that democracies have been suffering from political paralysis since the 1980s. There's a huge literature on the judicialization of politics that precisely points to the empowerment of judiciaries around the globe and of international organizations because democratic governments are increasingly, have been having difficulty for now over 40 years, delivering the goods to people. Failures of political institutions via three mechanisms, I'm going to argue to you, redound to the benefit of military institutions. That is not really super intuitive. If you had asked me, I would have said, those who trust, following from Bob Putnam's classic work, those who believe, who trust in institutions, they're more likely to trust in military institutions as well. When institutions are trusted, military institutions will be trusted too. When democratic political institutions are failing, when people's trust in government is falling, so should their trust in military institutions. But that's not the case. And it's not the case for three reasons. First, from below. There seems to be what I would call a halo effect. When people believe that government is corrupt, when they have little faith in political institutions, when they see those institutions and individuals as untrustworthy and incompetent, those institutions that are aspirationally apolitical, I'll explain that in a moment, they benefit. What does it mean to be aspirationally apolitical? That means that those institutions that legitimate themselves as being outside the political system, judges, and the judiciary, the police, the military, they benefit. And I call it a halo effect because for those who have children or for those who have siblings, if you've ever, for those with more than one, I should say, whenever one child behaves or one sibling behaves poorly, the halo immediately grows on the other one, right? They become saintly in the eyes of their parents, right? They're the good ones. And that's what's going on here as well, right? Those institutions that are apolitical in the ways they legitimate themselves benefit because people have motivated bias to displace their trust onto those institutions. You will immediately say, I want to preempt your question, wait a second. Military institutions, courts, police, we know they often are shot through with politics and partisanship. We know that they often act in ways contrary to that apolitical legitimation. Even if that's their aspiration, they often don't live up to it. That is, of course, true. And when they do that, trust in those institutions declines. Or even slightly more accurately, they come to be judged by the very same criteria by which political institutions are judged. Right? Then, trust in those apolitical institutions and more political institutions then correlates. But otherwise, here I'm arguing they're inversely correlated. Now, politicians, by the way, know this. And that generates a halo effect from above, which is as politicians see that they are not trusted, they want to associate themselves with the institutions that are, in fact, trusted, hoping some of that, they can bask in some of that reflected glory. And perhaps they will be a little bit more trusted themselves. That gives them, they don't have incentives to double down on rhetoric and rituals that venerate the military, hoping that they will be perceived as less political politicians. But there is a third dynamic. As we've all become aware, one of the key drivers of populism is deep distrust in the political system. And populists, in the title of the article that I'm now finishing up, populists love dead soldiers, but often hate live officers. I'm going to talk about the hating live officers at the end, but right now let's just focus on why they love to love, make themselves seem to love, particularly dead soldiers. Right? Populism by its nature highlights the corruption of existing elites, populists speak in the name of the putative people, and to paraphrase my nation's dear leader, no joke, no reaction. To paraphrase Donald Trump, they are going to drain the swamp, right? And they are going to tear down that existing system. Populists have a very concrete political problem, greater than any other kind of leader, because their very legitimation is rooted in mass plebiscitary politics. They need elections. They have to mobilize the people. But heaven forfend, they don't want the people to actually speak and have any political power. That is the last thing they want. They know the people's interests better than the people themselves know their interests. So how do you mobilize people power without actually giving the people any power? Militarism, veneration of the military, is a cultural solution to this political problem. Because soldiers, especially dead soldiers, have made the ultimate sacrifice for the political community. But in the populist narrative, they've gone off to march, gone off to their death willingly and cheerfully and with obedience and discipline. They are mobilized. They represent what they would love their citizens to be. That is mobilized, but by the same token, quite obedient. And dead soldiers are ideal for this purpose because they can't talk back. They can't say, no, I was scared shitless when I went off to war. Or, no, my life was completely wasted by the officers who were completely irresponsible, by the officers who were feckless, right? The dead soldiers, unlike live soldiers can be terribly inconvenient. Dead soldiers, on the other hand, just the opposite. So populists love dead soldiers. So let me give you a little bit of, these are right now theoretical hypotheses. Okay, how many people are comfortable with the coefficient plot? You know what this means to look at it. You're like, what the frick am I looking at? Okay, we're going to start from 0. I am no great lover of statistical data, but I do know enough to present a coefficient plot in the simplistic way that I understand it. Okay, so here we have, what you don't see here is the dependent variable, that which we are seeking to explain, is confidence in the armed forces. This is based on the confidence data from Gallup, 2006 to 2021 that I showed you earlier. Here are a bunch of independent variables. I've not shown you all the other control variables that are underlying this coefficient plot. So they're out there. They're the standard demographic, political ideology, all that kind of stuff. So what do we see? Anything that overlaps with 0. So here we have the estimate. This represents the 95% confidence interval, right? In other words, there's a 95% likelihood that the actual point in this statistical estimate lies somewhere here. Okay? This is a point estimate. Now, what you don't want, right, we say something is statistically significant if that 95% estimate does not cross over this dotted 0 line. If it does, we say it's statistically insignificant, meaning we cannot confidently tell you that the effect is different from 0. Okay? That's the basic idea. So, when it's to the right, it means that there's a positive correlation. And when it's to the left, it means there is a negative correlation of these variables with the thing we're interested in, which is confidence in the armed forces. And this is explaining variation in confidence in the armed forces. So, remember, this is an aspirationally apolitical institution. We expected that, therefore, trust in the armed forces and trust in the police and the judiciary should correlate positively with each other. When trust in the military, in the police and the judiciary is higher, trust in the military should also be higher. Lo and behold, that's what we find, right? And we can read the degree of, this is not a measure now of statistical significance, we can read the substantive significance and the relative substantive significance directly off, right? So the fact that those two variables are farther to the right means that for each 1 unit change in those variables, that has a bigger effect than the next thing, which is perception of government corruption, right? But perception of government corruption is also positive and statistically significant, meaning when the government is perceived as more corrupt, meaning when people trust government less, and we use various alternative measures too, people trust the military more. When VDEM uses this thing called the Military Dimension Index that basically represents how central is the military to determining the government. When it's 0, that's like the UK. When it's 1, that's when the military is ruling directly, and then there's various measures in between. So, the more the military is involved in government, meaning when the MDI is higher, meaning the military is not true to its apolitical legitimation, trust in the military is lower. Right? It's below 0. It's significant and below 0. We have other hypotheses that relate to this about conscription and civil war. Not happy to talk about that in the Q&A, and happy to present some interesting interactions in the Q&A about the Military Dimension Index. Because while it is true the trust in the military is lower, as I said, more accurately, it means that if you're a thoroughly political military, you'll be judged by political standards. And indeed, the evidence that I can show you is very strong, that politicized militaries are judged by political standards. Governments aren't always distrusted. It depends on their performance. When the government is doing well on economic performance and the military is doing well on human rights, people trust the military more under these circumstances. So, but populists, let me just give you a couple of quick stories, right? India, 2014, Narendra Modi, the BJP, comes into office. He has, as critical to the BJP's election manifesto, is building a war memorial at India Gate in the heart of Delhi. This had been promised or spoken about for 50 years. Nothing came of it. Modi and BJP promise it and then immediately build it. It's built by 2018. You can go there and see it today. In Turkey, the populist Erdogan promotes the myth of what we would call Gallipoli. It's a great Ottoman victory, what they call it Çanakkale, and that becomes central. He promotes trips to Çanakkale and builds new monuments there, and has a big iftar feast held there, and on and on and on. Poland, under the populist Law and Justice Party, the PiS, central to their political civil religion is the myth of those they call the cursed or doomed soldiers. That is, the anti-Nazi, then became anti-communist partisans who waged war until the late 40s through the early 50s. And of course, Donald Trump comes into office in 2017, surrounded by those that he hails as my generals, right? They're not dead soldiers, they are live soldiers, and believe me, Trump comes to regret it, quite obviously. Okay, there is much, much more to be said about the origins of militarism in this sense. So what can I tell you about the consequences? So I don't want to go on too long, so I'm just going to talk a bit about support for the use of force. Maybe, right, okay, fine. Let's imagine I persuaded you that militarism exists and that it's been rising. But you might say maybe it's basically harmless. Like, who cares? Right? Peter Feaver, one of the leading scholars of civil military relations in the US, speaks very awkwardly of what he calls pedestalization, placing the military on a pedestal. And he says, it's not the best thing in the world. It's not great. Right? It's not great for deference to the military and for democratic civil military relations. But it's also not the worst thing in the world. He said it's worse than the alternative, which is, from his vantage point, which is taking the military down a notch. So when I started this project, I thought that militarism might actually have positive consequences. I thought it might actually be a good thing, because maybe if people thought that these soldiers were paragons of patriotism and good citizenship, that would mean that they felt a sense of obligation to them. And I don't know about you, but when I feel a sense of obligation, I feel like I owe someone more, and maybe I need to be more careful about sending them into harm's way. That's what I thought going in. Turned out I was very, very wrong. Right? It wasn't, in fact, the logic of obligation that I just described. It was, in fact, more the logic of consent. When people believe that soldiers are patriots or good citizens, or when we primed them experimentally to see soldiers as patriots or good citizens, turned out that people were more supportive of military missions. And conversely, when they either believed beforehand or when we primed them to think that soldiers were motivated primarily by the pay and benefits on offer, that generated less support for military missions in our surveys and survey experiments in the US, the UK, France, and Israel. In 4 very different democracies with some of them questionably democracies, with very different traditions of citizenship, with very different military recruitment systems, with very different levels of involvement in military operations. So why is that? Not obligation, we came to think, but rather consent. When people think or are primed to believe that soldiers are patriots or good citizens, they believe that those folks really support the military and its core missions. And when people think that, then they are very comfortable sending them into harm's way. They think that they are, right? Empathy is basically, empathy is not this, again, when I thought this, I said, empathy, then an empathetic person is never going to want to send people into harm's way, because nobody wants to die. But actually, what empathy really means is you want for people what they want for themselves. That is true empathy. So if you think that a soldier is a patriot, a good citizen, who really believes in the mission of the military, and you therefore, you think that they want to be deployed, then you're much more comfortable supporting that same military mission. And an empathetic individual, and people vary in their levels of empathy, obviously, the more they believe that soldiers are motivated by pay and benefits for extrinsic reasons, not really into what the military is doing, they don't think the person really wants to be deployed, then they are going to be less supportive of military missions. So, here we have the independent variable is their prior beliefs. So this is observational. We ask people, why do you think soldiers primarily serve? And we gave them the options of citizen, patriot, pay and benefits, or they were desperate to escape adverse circumstances. And then we, a bunch of other people, not me, did impressive statistical work to say what is the probability, given a certain specification of the statistical model, that they will favor the mission. And lo and behold, I want to draw your attention to the very stark differences between the patriotic prior belief and the desperate prior belief. Now, this is just observational. And then observationally, we also said, we asked them afterwards, we said, how likely is it that a particular soldier, whom we named Michael Cameron in the story, we didn't tell them anything yet about whether, this is just observationally, we asked them how likely is it that he approves of the mission. And people who believed, right, this correlated very strongly, as you'll see, with their perceived motivation for service, right? Moving from that it is very unlikely that Cameron favored the mission to very likely that Cameron favored the mission led to a very substantial increase in the probability that the respondent themselves favored the mission. An increase of from about a little over 50% to a little over 80%, a difference of around 30%. Here we have, if we're looking at the experiment. So for the experiment, and I can show you what some of these look like, we gave people a fake news story in which we told them we changed the name of the soldier, and we told them it was a real news story where we simply changed the name of the place where they were supposed to intervene. Again, the Israel story had to be a little different. For France, the US, and the UK, we told them it was a place called Martija, right? But for the Israel, it implied that it was a distance away. That doesn't make sense for Israelis who never intervene militarily except in their immediate environs. So we told them, we gave them a real story that was counterterrorism operation in Lebanon. You'll see that, this was a while ago, so this is not post-October 7th, it's pre-October 7th, but you'll see what that data looks like. Here you have, though, in all 4 countries, whenever they got the intrinsic prime, that is, where they were told that the soldier is serving for reasons of patriotism or good citizenship, they believed that the soldier themselves were more likely to favor the mission. Right? Statistically significant, doesn't overlap with 0, and to the right, toward the more favorable line. Now, this is going to be a bit overwhelming, but I assure you it's not so overwhelming. Right? This is all 4 countries. We've got a bunch of control variables. We have perceived soldier support at the very top, right? How much do you think the soldier supports the mission? And we have the intrinsic prime right below it. Now, here's what I want you to take away from this very complex-looking graph. In all 4 countries, believing that the soldier themselves supported the mission, that is the very top line, has a very large effect on the respondent themselves supporting the mission. If they believe the soldier supports the mission, they themselves are far more likely to support the mission. Does that make sense? People see that? What's striking again, on this kind of coefficient plot, the size of the effect can be read directly off how far it is to the right or the left. So what's striking, there are lots of things that we know affect people's support for military missions. Tons and tons of surveys have shown us that women tend to be much less supportive of spending money on defense, of supporting military missions. Lots of surveys would show us that conservative people, political ideology, if they are More positive in our survey means more conservative. More conservative folks are far more likely to support military service. We ask questions about hawkishness. We ask a very basic question about how effective do you think the use of force generally is versus diplomacy in international affairs. No shock. Hawkish people more likely to support a prospective military operation, right? Super intuitive. Let me just finish the talk, 1 second. What I want you to look at is notice that perceived soldier support has as big, if not bigger, and a larger effect than any of those variables that feature so prominently in the existing literature. And if I had shown you data, which I don't actually have, I don't think I have it, when we did not have perceived soldier support and only had the intrinsic prime in the regression analysis, it is positive. When we insert perceived soldier support, the intrinsic prime goes to 0. What does that tell you? That tells you that the effect of the intrinsic prime is running through what we would expect, which is perceived soldier support. My colleague Robert, co-author, did a sophisticated thing called the causal mediation analysis. Don't ask me any questions because I cannot explain it beyond that, which showed that the vast majority of the causal effect is running through that variable. Yes?
Just what do you mean by education?
How do we operationalize it? Right, so higher levels of education. So education, as you can see, has no significant effect on people's support for the military operation in the scenarios that we're laying out, right? Age has some more, older people are somewhat more supportive on average in 3 of the 4 cases. These are just control variables, they're not the variables that are of interest to us. What I would want you to take away is that a lot of other things that we might think would matter, military experience, right? The substantive effect of perceived soldier support is very great compared to all these other things. Okay, now the easier way to understand this, and we're almost done, is, right, these kinds of things are actually easier to comprehend than the other. So as we move from soldier opposition on the left to soldier approval on the right, what you see is that the probability of the respondent favoring the operation increases across all 4 countries. Even in Israel, where baseline hawkishness, baseline levels of support for military operations are not surprisingly higher. They may also be higher because we gave them a real place, right, that seems very realistic to them. But notice, it goes from about 75% support at one level to nearly 100% support once they believe the soldier has approved. Same thing is true in the US, the UK, and France. All 3 they begin in very different places. I honestly don't understand why the French are so low here. It's actually a puzzle to me. But what matters to me is they all go up and they end up in basically the same place as we move toward perceived soldier approval. There's a lot more to be said about the effects of militarism on civil-military relations, on deference to the military. Happy to talk about that in Q&A. Support for military benefits, the take-home is it actually does not yield more support for military benefits. So if you thought that was a positive, not so much. We have a piece on the Armed Forces Covenant here in the UK that I think is very revealing about that. By the very nature of this talk, I have ignored a great deal of nuance. I'm happy to get into the nuance in Q&A. So let me just close with some implications and further consequences. First, big picture story, I think that militarism is a pretty raw deal. Veneration of the military is not good for countries, and it's not good for soldiers themselves. It leads, we see, to more support for the use of force, and as I could show you, it leads to more deference and no greater support for benefits. This is all happening in combination with a variety of other factors that are increasing support for use of force across the West. Replacing men and women with machines, using offshore technologies like drones that will, against those who don't have drones in particular. Improved military medicine, at least in places where you have control of the air. That means more injuries and fewer deaths, right? Which also leads to more support for the use of force. And of course, we've gotten rid of the mass army in most countries. So we have a bunch of things that are already leading people to be more supportive of the use of force than they were once upon a time. Now we have this added on, this cultural dimension that also softens people up for using military force. It's bad for the body politic and bad for soldiers themselves. Second, I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A. One effect of politicizing the military is it's very easy, perhaps surprisingly easy, to go from venerating the military to denigrating the military. Once you are in a place, once you're in a position where the military is used for political purposes, by scoring political points, by venerating them, by idealizing them, by basking in their reflected glow, you can also score political points at times by beating up on the military. Just to bring this home, you may recall Donald Trump starts by loving my generals. He has a steady falling out with them. One after another is fired. He does not, however, publicly break with the military, publicly break with his generals, until September of 2020. The Atlantic Monthly in the United States breaks a big story, interviews with his first Homeland Security chief and his second White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, who talks about that Trump really had difficulty understanding why anybody would do military service, that he referred to the war dead of World War I when he was in France as suckers and didn't see why we should go there, that he sat in, Kelly's own son was killed in Iraq and they were going to Arlington National Cemetery to visit him, and Trump was sort of incredulous. Why, these are smart guys. Why would they do this? Trump just couldn't comprehend it. Trump, of course, pushes back very, very hard. And at a press conference, he says, the generals don't love me. The enlisted love me. The generals hate me because I'm all trying to bring it to an end, all these wars from which they profit. And that begins, if you remember, in the spring of 2021 is when something striking happens, which is that we used to think that attacks on the military were the third rail of American politics, especially for Republicans. But conservatives and Republicans start in the spring of 2021 attacking the woke military. Starts with about the teaching of critical race theory at West Point, Mark Milley having apologized for partially walking across a cleared Lafayette Square the previous June. And it's been a steady drumbeat in the 4 years since. In fact, it's basically a way of auditioning for Trump's national security team, was to attack the woke military. This is sort of central to the identity of Michael Waltz, who is Trump's national security advisor, and Pete Hegseth, Trump's Secretary of Defense. And all this connects to my last point, which is that populism, by its very nature, and of course we're seeing a world where populism is increasingly popular, where Marine Le Pen could be the next French president, where the AfD is now the largest party in the second largest party in the German parliament, right? Populists necessarily, eventually assault military professionalism. This is the hate dead live officers part of the story. In addition to the love dead soldiers, hate live officers. What do populists do? Their political strategy is eventually breaking down any of the intermediary institutions that mediate between the people, that mediate between their will and the outputs of government. So what do? They attack the media, they attack academic universities, they attack the judiciary, they seek to replace the bureaucracy. Oh, it's all going on right now in my country. Every single bit of it. The military has almost not featured at all in literature on populism. This is very peculiar, because there is one very powerful institution, which is perhaps the greatest veto player of all, potentially, and that's the military. And populists know this. And that means they either have to take over the military, which of course Erdogan did very effectively in Turkey, which the peace did to some degree. They really did a purge of the upper ranks of the military in Poland. Or, and as Trump, by the way, has warned, there's been reports in the Wall Street Journal of appointing a warrior board that will get rid of those generals that they deem unfit to command. A warrior board of former generals, I should say. Or, if the military proves too strong for that, too independent, like in the US at the end of the first Trump administration, like in Israel, then they attack the military, denying that claiming the military is illegitimate and incompetent. In the US, this takes the form of attacks on woke generals. In Israel, it is not Netanyahu himself, but his more, even farther right-wing allies, talking regularly about the Oslo generals, that is, those who supported the peace process, who they view as restraining them on a regular basis. Populists are no fans of military professionalism, and that is part and parcel. It is like the flip side of venerating the military, right, is the denigration and ultimately the attack on military professionalism. I will stop there, and I'm eager for all of your questions and comments.